yeah, I'm not here to teach you anything. So basically, this talk is just like a disaster porn about like what can go wrong in the relationship with venture capitalists and open source projects. Because my take is, and again, I don't want to make like a big bad VC kind of notion for you. I'm just like making some reality here. So it's not all bad and it's not all good. It's as usual something in between. And the problem is that entrepreneurs and VCs usually don't understand each other. So just yesterday, I was meeting my ex-colleague from the VC fund that I was working with. And he was telling me about the open source projects and the portfolio that I know really well from the community perspective. And I suddenly understand that the entrepreneurs are basically lying to their VCs. And it's not like on purpose, but it's kind of like lying to your psychotherapist. It makes no sense. You can, and you probably do it for him, to her, to tell you that, oh no, you're wrong, and like here is actually why, and help you go through this. But we see that just too busy, and they have so many projects and everything. So I think it's all one big misunderstanding all the time. So here in this talk, I actually want to just show you that it's a very specific world that has very specific rules in it, and they can be good or bad, but you need to know about them when you start working with a VC. So yeah, and my choice was to leave a VC, although we did like a lot of work with open source and invested in a bunch of open source companies. And I did work with also government sector and the intersection of private and public sector, trying to figure out different ways to support open source companies and communities from other angles. So we probably won't have time for that, but if somebody is interested in other models and VCs, we can also discuss it. But this talk is specifically on the relationship with venture capitalists. And one of the questions that was already a bit covered in the previous part is like what actually defines a good open source project compared to what defines a successful startup. And of course, there is like way more things that any open source developer will tell me like matters for him. But from what I see, these are like the top 3. But basically, if you want to create a big community and if you want to trust from community and respect from community, you cannot really focus on any specific use case because you want the community to discover use cases. You want them to take the project to different verticals, to work on it, to figure out like how they can use it and change it and whatever, but it cannot be a narrow focus. And that is exactly what all VCs want. Even if they, at first, they just might invest in a company for other reasons, but they're always looking for something that is focus, that is growth, that is a metric that they can measure, that is like something. So if you get to a use case where you get repetitive sales, and they can understand the client profile and the sales velocity and how do you get this type of clients, how do you get the funnel and everything, they would like, oh, we will throw more money at it. Just here, get the next round and the next round and just put all your effort there. It's working, you can get money. So, okay, that happens, sounds good, right? The company is growing, but what happens to your open source project at that moment? Can you keep in the company still this relationship with the community, this discovery of new use cases and everything? And again, in most cases, I'd say no, just on the human level, because it's so hard to manage all these different directions, because just like your organization changes. It has more salespeople than developers. It has different culture. It has all this like, the mind of the CEO is all just about that, how to grow. And the mind of CTO is all these requests from these customers, like what do they need, not what the community needs. It's just like very hard to keep working on both. So the question is, okay, why do VCs even invest in open source? How do these things intersect? If we talk about metrics, of course, we can measure metrics like other metrics, like popularity, number of stars on GitHub. I know some VCs do that. But how? Like, how do they translate into business metrics? And I have two answers. And one answer is just hype. So everybody in this world is always in the FOMO mode. It is, in many, many cases, just like, let's invest first and think about the business model later. And that's fine. Again, the hypes happen. So this is my view on the Gartner hype cycle, like how it actually works from the eyes of the VC. So there is a very important part of this hype cycle where you actually just want to run as fast as possible and invest in something, because otherwise you just miss the industry. So you won't have any bet in it. So you make a bet. And you make a bet on whatever reasons. You can make a bet because the founders are cool, or you can make a bet because you just see some growth and some metrics, like stars, maybe, something. So you think the community is accepting it, somebody is accepting it. So you can choose based on many, many weird indicators how and what to invest in. But a lot of funds just choose something. The question is, okay, but open source is not really like an industry. I would say that in many industries, open source is like come and go in terms of the hype. In many industries, it's like, for example, in AI, of course, like everybody talks about open source now. What's open source AI? What's open source model? And we'll have a panel about that as well. But it's a lot of trends here, and sometimes it's trendy, sometimes it's not. I would say that in a lot of new industries that come from the open source community, that basically the projects, they are not initially coming from the business side, not the disruption of some industry or whatever, but the projects that come just from a bunch of people hacking in the open source community and finding something that works, then the industry will have the part of the open source hype. But this is basically just fashion. It's nothing more. There is no reason here, and VCs are not trying to find the reason here, they're just running with it. But the most important part for me is like coming to open source is like actually how does it help the business? Because again, VCs are all about business. And they will ask all these questions after the investment. So even if they invest based on hype, which happens a lot, once you become a funded startup, you're always on a timeline, always. And the timeline is very much accelerated because you have to fundraise the next round and then the next round. And every time you do that, the next VCs actually have a little bit different perspective on what you're doing. So it's when it's Series A VCs, it can be just a good thesis. When it's Series B VCs, it has to be a good use case. So you're supposed to have been already in the space that you know and can do repetitive sales and everything. So if you haven't found it, really hard to do Series B. And for Series C investments, it's just all about growth metrics, just like throwing more money at the same use case. So basically, the question of the business model will always come up anyway. And how do you monetize and everything? And again, it's not necessarily just like classical open source business models. It can be any business model. Or you can just use open source as some other values, not specifically the business model. So you can just be using it to open doors. You can be using it to have faster sales cycle because of easier compliance. You can be using it for just specific purposes and not making it like the core front of your open source company. But again, what happens next? And I think this is the most important part that startups usually don't think about because they're so much focused on just how to get a VC that they're not really thinking like how to work with them after. And of course, everybody knows that you will get a board member and that you have to fundraise the next round and everything. But like, what questions are you going to be asked in the fundraising the next round? What questions the board asks? What power does the board has? All these questions, apart from the classical questions that every startup works with, and you can read a lot of books about it. But for the open source world, it's actually how I see it. It's first, you either have to monetize or you need to have a very good strategy how to sell the company. And like early on, not 10 years later. And that's again, these timelines, they come from a very simple fact. The VCs have very short lifetime. So usually a fund is 10 years, plus 2 maybe, you can get an extension. But that's basically the timeline when the limited partners, the investors in the fund, expect value. So let's say the first 4 years are for investments in the VC lifetime, but that basically means you have about 6 years to get the exit for any company in your portfolio. That's why you run so fast. That's why you want to sell it as fast as possible. That's why you ask this question when you invest, not 5 years later. 5 years later, you already need to have like people selling it. So basically, these questions, they are always in the mind and they're always on the table. So if you don't have a good answer here, it could be a very big problem, like selling to the fundraising the next stages or finding the good team again, because even when you grow the company to certain levels, you have to answer the questions: where do you attract people for it? Where do you get the great sales manager? You have to answer all the same questions. And again, the focus, as I said, you need to have repeatable, measurable, referenceable, all these words that VCs love. But then, again, how do you actually keep your open source project alive? And this is what I say, what I mean when I say that VCs ruin everything. It's not that they ruin the company. The company will be fine. They know how to make the business. They know how to help you hire people. They know how to help you find the business model. They know how to fundraise next rounds. And they do understand open source. It's not that VCs are stupid. They do understand open source. They just don't care about the project as much as you do. So if you have an open source project that you consider yours, that you care about, and you care about your reputation, and you care about what happens to the community, these values VCs will not share. VCs share like using the open source to make the business better, not like the community itself. So it's always a very hard interplay between these two. And I actually will jump here because I want to show some examples of that. So there are 2 examples of our portfolio companies that I will not name, but I think people could guess. So basically, in both use cases, the companies are still very successful. They both raised Series C, and there probably would be pretty good exits. But basically, in both cases, the initial tech team and the CTOs left because open source is just not needed anymore. The company has found its niche, it's growing, there are good sales, but it's basically just boring business at this moment. It's just doing sales, it's supporting your clients. And what about open source? Well, at some point they all started like, yeah, we have it. And both of them are not closed source yet, so they have open source part. But it's not developing that much. Actually, it's not developing at all because like only the few developers from the company contribute to it. There is no external community. There are no other projects that grew from the open source side, no other companies that supports it. So it's basically just there. Again, just for easier sales, compliance, the usual stuff. But again, the question is, what do you care about? Do you care about the open source or do you care about the success? And I think that's the most important thing that I want people to answer. Like, none of this is bad stuff. It's in both cases, it's kind of just a choice. What do you want to spend your time, your focus? What do you want to invest in? And what do you want to learn from it? And even in these cases, what I want to highlight is what happens next. And there are 2 options. One option is basically being very bitter, like, yeah, the VCs ruined everything, or my CEO ruined everything, or VCs gave me a CEO that ruined everything. So it's many, many options like that. And sometimes the CTO or the initial co-founder who created the project just takes it and forks it. If it's already closed source, they still can do that and bring it to a foundation. But basically thinks that it all went wrong and wants to try again. And sometimes they want to try again as not a startup anymore. They can do a nonprofit, they can do a lab, they can do something else. Sometimes they want to do another startup, but like be a CEO this time and not take stupid VCs, just like be more assertive, get better VCs, and do that. And sometimes, and this is kind of a good option, when it's not the problem of the CEO being stupid, just feedback from the industry, that in this particular industry, it works like this. And I actually have a very good example from FOSDEM that I just been at, because there was a very interesting dev room for the small operational systems, like special purpose operational systems for embedded devices. And the room had 20 people, and among 20 people, there were 5 operational systems. And at some point, everybody was like talking, yeah, we all have some use cases, we all have some clients. Most of the people actually work for large corporations at this point. They were either acquired, the projects were acquired, or something happened. They just happened to be a lifestyle business, for example, just selling appliance with this operational systems or something else. But at some point, they all agreed that none of the clients actually buy them for who they are. So basically, all the clients at this point just want Kubernetes. And if there is also an operational system somewhere there, it's fine. But it's not what they buy. But none of these people in the room, besides the only one who actually was an entrepreneur, has admitted it. And so only one has moved on. Basically admitted it, said, yes, the community, the market, they don't want that. And I'll move on, I'll do something else. But everybody else, they just can't admit it. They're getting money for it, they're in a large corporation, they're fine. So it was kind of a sad dev room to me, but I realized that sometimes it's not a bad thing to be an entrepreneur in this case, because it keeps you honest. You really cannot not see the signs from the market. You can decide what to do with it, you can choose to continue, you can choose to pivot in some other direction, or you can just choose to move on, but you definitely cannot live in denial, like, oh, I still get a paycheck. So somebody is using it, or maybe not. So in this case, I actually see it as a very good sign that it helps, it keeps you honest. So of course, as I said, there are some bad sides of it, because it's a very specific game that you have to know and have to admit and play by its rules. And I also want to actually come back a little bit and say a few words about the AI industry. Because like I get a lot of questions, is it same? Is it not the same for open source AI? And my answer is, again, based on the previous talk, the answer, even to say what open source company is a problem, but saying what's an open source AI company, like what is it? And this is how I see the industry, basically. So there are vertical AI applications that are based maybe on an open source part, on the open source model, on something. But basically what you sell is some very specific vertical application. And for me, in this case, they're just being treated the same as any business in any vertical. It's not like any specific stuff from the open source. Then there is, of course, open source software and infrastructure. And there is a lot of investments in that space right now. You can read Andreessen Horowitz paper, for example, about the infrastructure stack. It's just amazing. They covered all of it. And most of it is open source. But it's all the same rules as usual open source. Nothing special about AI. It's infrastructure, it's software, it's very usual stuff. There are, of course, foundational models. And there is a bunch of investments going into them right now. And again, it's not something new. Remember DeepMind. Remember when Google acquired them, everybody wanted to be just an R&D company and be acquired for hundreds of millions. How many of them did, though? So it's always, again, the hype cycle. There is, when something like this starts to happen, yes, you can make an R&D story, you can make it an open source, but it will be treated as any other R&D story. So if you have amazing people, and they might be acquired if you like got the right spot, but again, nothing specific about open source, just any good R&D story. Is it good? Is it bad? That's the question. But then there is the rest, and again, we don't have enough time to talk about it, but my biggest interest is in this other part. And like, what other models are there? How people are developing? How are they collaborating on them? Not inside enterprises, but in the open. Like, what is it? Like, how it looks, and can any other companies or not companies, startups, something happen there? But again, no investments there yet. So I actually will wrap up and leave some room for questions. But if I just wanted to summarize this talk really quick, is basically just always think about what are you getting and what are you giving up in terms of the next period of your life. It's not forever, it's not the biggest choice, and you can always like change it going forward. But if you're interested in learning more about business and how to build it and what business models and there and how learn how to work with money, how to learn with venture capitalists, it's actually a very interesting part, and upside is actually great. So who doesn't want to build a unicorn? But if you care more about your reputation and your project, you might think about other options than just plain classical VC model and just getting a check from them. But one more thing that I wanted to say is that it is still the biggest money source available. Again, at FOSDEM, there were interesting numbers that from non-VC world, the money that came to open source, like from other investments, was like 14 million in a year. So it's basically nothing. So it is still the biggest source of investments and money. There might be others, and for me, I actually believe that AI might bring opportunity for others as well. But right now, it's just what it is. It's the rule of the game. So that's it. Some questions?